Archive 13, the Vitebsk Strangler, 14 women, 1 city, 11 years of silence. Number Introduction. The snow had been falling since midnight. By the time the first worker arrived at the collective farm road outside Vitebsk on that January morning in 1974, the landscape looked undisturbed, clean, white, the kind of stillness that makes a person stop and breathe it in. Then they saw the scarf. Yelena Vasilieva, 26, a textile mill administrator, lay half buried and adrift at the roadside. Her own woolen scarf had been twisted so tightly around her throat that the fabric had cut through the outer layer of skin. She had been placed, not dropped, not dumped, with a deliberateness that investigators would only recognize years later. No struggle marks in the surrounding snow. No footprints leading away. Only the faint compression of tire tracks that had stopped, then continued on toward the city. The case file opened that morning would not close for 11 years. The man who killed her was already at work. The Vitebsk Strangler murdered at least 14 women across the Byelorussian SSR between 1971 and 1985. He drove the same roads as his victims. He attended the same community events. He passed the same militia checkpoints. He was, by every external measure, unremarkable. A husband, a father, a reliable employee, and for more than a decade, that ordinariness was his most lethal weapon. This is not a story about a monster lurking at the edges of society. It is a story about the man at the center of it. The case endures because it forces a question that comfortable people would rather not ask. How does extraordinary violence survive inside a system designed to see everything? The answer is both specific to the Soviet state and disturbingly universal. Hapitin, the Sidi Degura Wari Hosesi Bakhtari Benja in Poj, but more. The situated in the Soviet Northwest, where Belarus pressed against the Russian border, the city was a gray, functional place, provincial rail hub, textile center, truck repair depot. The Dvina River cut through it, dark and sluggish in winter, barely warmer in summer. Apartment blocks the color of old concrete rose in uniform rows beside factory gates. Shift whistles marked the hours more reliably than clocks. This was not a place where people disappeared into crowds. In Vitebsk, everyone knew which bus their neighbor caught, which enterprise they reported to, which evening they visited relatives. The Soviet internal passport system tethered residents to specific addresses and workplaces. Movement outside your registered district required documentation. The state had engineered visibility into daily life as a feature, not a side effect. It was, on paper, the worst possible environment for a predator. On paper. Gennady Mikhasevich was born in 1947 in a small village in the Vitebsk Oblast. He was the product of the post-war Soviet countryside. Scarce resources, strict collective discipline, and the particular loneliness of rural boyhood in a nation still absorbing its staggering wartime losses. He completed compulsory schooling without distinction. He served his military obligation, as all young men did, and returned to the city without incident. He became a driver, later a mechanic at a state enterprise. He married. He had children. He attended the mandatory civic functions, participated in the community volunteer programs, kept his vehicle maintained and his paperwork current. Neighbors, when later asked, would reach for the same word repeatedly: tihi, quiet. Not unfriendly, not strange, just quiet. The city's limited nightlife, the shortage of private automobiles, the long and isolated rural roads connecting Vitebsk to the surrounding villages. These were not incidental details of the setting. They were the architecture of opportunity. Women walked home from late shifts because buses were infrequent. They accepted rides from acquaintances, neighbors, men whose faces were passably familiar, because refusal felt both rude and impractical in weather that regularly dropped below -20. Mikhasevich understood this before he could have articulated it. He was already watching. Fact: the Vitebsk region in the 1970s had one of the lowest private car ownership rates in the Western USSR. A man with access to a vehicle occupied a position of practical social authority. He could offer something others could not. Myth versus reality. Soviet state media of the era maintained that serious violent crime was a symptom of capitalist social decay, essentially foreign to socialist society. Official crime statistics were classified. The result was not less crime. It was less institutional willingness to see it. Chapter 2, Early Warning Signs. Nobody saw the threshold being crossed. That is almost always the way. Mikhasevich told investigators, years later and with an unsettling clinical detachment, that the impulses had arrived during adolescence. A girl in his village had rejected him, publicly, in the way that small communities make humiliations permanent. He described the incident not with anger, but with precision, the way a man describes a weather event that changed the course of a journey. It happened. Everything after it was different. Teachers who were interviewed in the aftermath of his arrest recalled a withdrawn student, not disruptive, not aggressive, the kind of boy who sits near the back and watches. Family members noted periods of sudden, total withdrawal, days when he would barely speak, but they attributed these to ordinary adolescent moodiness, the kind that eventually resolves itself. It did not resolve itself. By his early 20s, the pattern had calcified. He began following women, on foot and then by car, maintaining distance, never speaking. He was rehearsing. Forensic psychiatrists who later studied the case recognized this phase immediately. The controlled approach, the progressive boundary testing, the accumulation of what profilers call pre-offense behavior, actions that do not yet constitute a crime but are structurally identical to the crime that follows them. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, the Russian forensic psychiatrist whose later work on serial offenders in the Soviet and post-Soviet space became foundational to the field, described the general profile in terms that apply precisely to Mikhasevich. The organized offender does not arrive at violence suddenly. He arrives at it gradually, carefully, almost bureaucratically. He prepares, he refines. By the time he acts, he has rehearsed the act so many times in his mind that the first murder does not feel like a beginning, it feels like a confirmation. No formal complaint reached the Vitebsk militia before the first killing, not one. The women he followed had perhaps noticed, perhaps felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with weather, the sensation of being watched by someone who has no intention of announcing themselves. But in a society where reporting such things felt both futile and vaguely hysterical, the feeling was absorbed and kept private. He carried a length of electrical wire in his vehicle. He had been carrying it for months before he used it. Fact. Mikhasevich stated during post-arrest interviews that he kept the wire coiled beneath the driver's seat, moving it to the glove box before approaching a potential victim. The act of relocating it was, he said, how he knew he had made a decision. Myth versus reality. Popular accounts of serial offenders frequently describe a single traumatic origin event, one wound that explains everything. Criminologists are more cautious. Dr. Nikolai Kuznetsov, writing in Soviet criminological literature of the late 1980s, noted that in documented Soviet cases, the pathway to serial violence was almost always cumulative, a layering of isolation, unchallenged fantasy, and specific environmental opportunity. No single cause, a system of causes. Chapter 3. The First Crime. December 1971. Temperature -18. The road to Polotsk is empty after 6 in the evening. Anna Federova, name reconstructed from trial records, 22 years old, had been on her feet since 7 that morning. She worked the day shift at Vitebsk Textile Combine, No. 3, one of the enormous Soviet fabric mills that employed thousands of women across the city, women who stood at looms for 8-hour stretches in air that smelled of machine oil and sizing chemicals, who wore their hair pinned tightly to keep it from the machinery, who ate their lunch from tin containers and discussed their children and their neighbors and their plans for the New Year holiday that was still 3 weeks away. Anna was not married. She lived with her mother in a low apartment block near the mill and had recently enrolled in evening technical courses, hoping to qualify for a supervisory position before she turned 25. Her mother later told investigators that Anna had spoken that morning about a coat she was saving to buy, dark wool, double-breasted, the kind that kept out the real cold. She was 2 weeks' wages away from it. She left the factory at 5:40 p.m. She was seen by a coworker at the bus stop near the main gate, standing in the dark, her breath clouding in the frozen air. The bus she needed ran infrequently. The walk home took 40 minutes in summer. In December, across iced pavements in the dark, longer. She did not take the bus. The vehicle that stopped beside her was a Soviet-era Gaz utility, the kind that was everywhere in the city, indistinguishable from a dozen other models, driven by workers and supervisors and collective farm officials. The man behind the wheel was known to her in the way that residents of a small city know faces without knowing names, familiar enough to lower the threshold of suspicion. The interior of the cab would have been warm. That mattered enormously. In -18, warmth is not a convenience. It is a physical relief that temporarily reorganizes every other calculation. She got in. 2 days later, a villager walking his dog along the tree line off the Polotsk road found her. She was lying on her back in the compressed snow at the edge of the trees, approximately 60 meters from the road surface. Her scarf, dark blue wool, hand-knitted, had been wound around her neck and twisted. Not knotted, twisted, which required sustained pressure and direct contact, a fact the medical examiner noted carefully in his report. No sexual assault, no theft. Her wage packet, still sealed, was in her coat pocket. The absence of obvious motive is the detail that should have alarmed investigators most. It did not. The Vitebsk city militia opened a case file, canvassed the area, interviewed co-workers and the bus stop witnesses, and found nothing that resolved the question of who or why. Without a motive, they could map onto familiar categories: robbery, a known conflict, a domestic grievance. The investigation stalled within weeks. The file did not close, but it stopped moving. Mikhasevich drove back to Vitebsk that night through the same darkness, along the same road. He parked, he went inside, he ate dinner with his family. The next morning, he went to work. Dr. Yevgeny Tselms, a forensic psychiatrist who later consulted on the compiled case materials for a Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs review, described the post-offense psychology with a precision that is difficult to read without discomfort. The first successful act does not produce guilt in this profile. It produces relief. The fantasy has been tested against reality and confirmed. What comes next is not remorse. It is patience. He will wait, but he already knows he will do it again. Anna Fedorova's coat, the dark wool, double-breasted one she had been saving for, was purchased by her mother after the funeral. She is buried in the municipal cemetery on the eastern edge of Vitebsk. Fact: the Polotsk road where Anna Fedorova was found had no street lighting beyond the city boundary. Darkness was structural, not incidental. Soviet infrastructure budgets prioritized industrial zones. Rural and peri-urban roads remained unlit through the 1980s. Myth versus reality. Early investigative theory in the Federova case leaned toward a crime of opportunity committed by a transient worker or passing trucker, someone, crucially, who was not from Vitebsk. This assumption that a local man, a known man, could not be responsible for this kind of crime delayed the investigation's focus for years. Criminologist Viktor Luniev later identified this cognitive bias as endemic across Soviet militia forces. The monster was assumed to come from outside. He almost never does. Chapter 4, The Pattern. He was consistent in a way that investigators should have found sooner. The approach was always the same: dusk or after dark, a woman walking alone on a road with little traffic, the offer of a ride made from a vehicle window, phrased as a courtesy. The acceptance, which came more often than it should have in a city where women were accustomed to trusting neighbors, because in Vitebsk, in the 1970s, the man who stopped at the roadside was almost never the danger. He was the solution to it. Then a short drive, a turn onto an unlit access road or forest track, strangulation, applied quickly, using whatever was at hand: electrical wire, a length of cord, the victim's own scarf. The act took less than 3 minutes. He rarely took souvenirs, which deprived investigators of the behavioral signature that might have connected cases earlier. But he did something else, something that the forensic reports describe with a clinical neutrality that somehow makes it worse. He rearranged his victims after death, positioned them. Adjusted clothing, not randomly and not identically, but with the consistent quality of deliberateness that suggested the posing was as important to him as the act that preceded it. He was making something. What it meant to him he was never fully able to explain. Victim selection was specific without being accidental. Women between 18 and 35, traveling alone, on the outer roads of Vitebsk and the surrounding oblast. Working women, women moving between shifts and homes in the dark, in the cold, in the routine vulnerability of Soviet female daily life. After 1978, something shifted. The intervals shortened. Where months had once separated incidents, now weeks passed, sometimes less. The escalation was not frenzied. It was methodical. It tracked directly with Mikhasevich's growing certainty that the militia was not connecting the cases. He was watching the investigation the way a man watches weather from a window, with detached, proprietary interest. He was right. The cases were not being connected. Number Chapter 5, The Victims. They were not statistics. That point requires emphasis, because the systematic way in which this case was investigated, the ligature comparisons, the tire track analysis, the categorization of victim typology, can make the women behind those designations feel abstract. They were not. Each one left a specific, irreplaceable absence behind her. Maria Koroleva, 19, worked the same production line as Anna Fedorova at Textile Combine Number 3. She had been engaged for 6 weeks when she died, in the spring of 1973. Her fiancé, interviewed during the 1987 trial, still carried her photograph in his wallet. It was 14 years old by then, the edges worn soft. Olga Rybakova, 27, was a nurse at Vitebsk City Hospital Number 2. Her shifts ended after midnight. She had told her supervisor she preferred the night rotation because it paid a marginal supplement, and she was saving to buy her mother a refrigerator. She was found on her usual walking route home, 300 meters from the hospital gate. The supplement she had saved amounted to half the price of the refrigerator. Svetlana Marchenko, name reconstructed from trial records, 21, was a student at the Vitebsk Veterinary Institute. She had been accepted to a competitive summer research program and had written a letter to her grandmother describing her plans. The letter was found unsent on her desk. Irina Sokolova, name reconstructed from trial records, 34, was a factory canteen supervisor and mother of 2 boys, aged 7 and 9. A neighbor testified that the older boy waited at the window every evening until he could see his mother turn the corner from the bus stop. Nadezhda Belova, name reconstructed from trial records, 23, had traveled from a village 60 kilometers outside Vitebsk to attend a training course for collective farm accountants. She was in the city for 4 days. She died on the 3rd. The list continues to 14. Every name in the trial record belongs to a woman who had plans, who had people who expected her home, who had something specific she was working toward, a coat, a refrigerator, an exam, a research program, a child watching from a window. Mikhasevich knew none of this when he chose them. He did not choose them for who they were. He chose them for where they were standing. At the 1987 trial, the families were seated together in the courtroom gallery, survivors of a collective loss, most of them meeting each other for the first time. Some had waited more than a decade for this room. A journalist present for the verdict described the silence when the 14 counts were read aloud as the kind of silence that has weight to it. Fact: Soviet court proceedings in capital cases during this period were typically closed to the general public. The Mikhasevich trial admitted immediate family members of victims as an exceptional measure, following pressure from the Vitebsk Regional Prosecutor's Office, which had itself faced scrutiny over the length of the investigation. Myth versus reality. A common assumption about Soviet-era criminal cases is that confessions were extracted under duress and therefore unreliable. In the Mikhasevich case, the confession was preceded by substantial physical evidence, tire tread matches, fiber analysis, witness identification. The confession corroborated details that investigators had not disclosed publicly, which forensic reviewers later cited as evidence of its credibility. Hashtag Chapter 6, The Hunt Begins. By 1983, the silence between cases had become impossible to explain away. 12 years had passed since Anna Fedorova's death. 9 women across at least 4 administrative districts had died in circumstances that shared an unmistakable signature: solitary female victims, rural roads, ligature strangulation, no sexual assault, no theft, deliberate body positioning. Each case had been processed at the district level. Each file sat in a different building. No single investigator had held all 12 in their hands at once. That changed when the Vitebsk Regional Prosecutor's Office assembled a task force. The room they worked in smelled of cigarette smoke and old paper. Filing boxes arrived from district militia offices, some neatly organized, some barely sorted. Lead investigator Nikolai Ignatenko, a 15-year veteran of the Regional Prosecutor's Service, later described the first week as an archaeological process. We were excavating what should have been visible from the beginning. What they found was both damning and demoralizing. The tire track impressions from 3 separate scenes matched the same wheel specification, a common Soviet pattern, but with a specific irregular wear mark on the rear left tire, consistent with a vehicle used heavily on uneven road surfaces. Ligature evidence showed a consistent technique, not knotting, but twisting, applied from behind, with the perpetrator's body weight used as leverage. The medical examiners who had written the individual reports had each noted this detail in isolation. None had seen another report that matched it. The coordination failure was structural. Soviet militia organization in the Byelorussian SSR divided operational responsibility between city and rural districts with overlapping but poorly integrated record systems. A killing 6 kilometers outside the Vitebsk city boundary was technically a rural matter. A killing inside the city perimeter was urban jurisdiction. The Vitebsk Strangler had almost certainly, without deliberate calculation, operated in the seam between those jurisdictions for years. Travel in groups after dark. Report suspicious vehicles to the nearest militia post. The language was characteristically Soviet in its bureaucratic formality, cautionary without being alarming, careful not to suggest that the state had failed to protect its citizens. The posters did not use the phrase serial killer. That designation carried an ideological weight the authorities were not prepared to acknowledge publicly. Women understood anyway. The factory floor conversations changed. The bus schedules were memorized more carefully. Groups of coworkers began walking together to the city boundaries before splitting toward their separate apartments. These were rational adaptations to an understood threat. They were also insufficient. In 1984, 2 more women died. The task force expanded. Investigators from Minsk, the Byelorussian capital, joined the Vitebsk team, bringing with them a procedural rigor that the overstretched regional office had struggled to maintain. Tire track databases were cross-referenced. Surviving witnesses from earlier cases were re-interviewed with newly standardized descriptions of vehicle type, color, and driver characteristics. A composite picture of the offender began to assemble itself. Male, approximately 30 to 40 years of age, local or with sustained local familiarity, access to a vehicle, not a passenger car, but a utility or light commercial vehicle, active on routes between the industrial zones and the outer road network. Moved at dusk or after dark, with consistency suggesting shift work discipline rather than erratic behavior. The profile fit thousands of men in Vitebsk, but it was narrowing. Dr. Anatoly Pristavkin, a Moscow-based criminologist who contributed to the task force review materials in 1984, offered a characterization that investigators found both useful and uncomfortable. You are looking for a man who believes himself to be invisible, not because he is clever, but because the system surrounding him has made him so. He has not avoided detection. Detection has avoided him. When you close that gap, he will feel it before you announce it. Watch for behavioral changes. He is monitoring you. He was. In late 1984, Mikhasevich's vehicle usage patterns changed. He drove less on the identified corridors. He varied his routes. The interval between the last confirmed 1984 victim and the next incident stretched to several months, the longest pause in 6 years. The investigation was not yet close enough to feel, but something in him had registered a shift. Vitebsk Task Force was one of the first in the Byelorussian SSR to formally apply inter-district case comparison methodology. The technique, routine in Western law enforcement by the early 1980s, was largely absent from Soviet investigative practice at the district level. The task force adapted it from Minsk criminal analysis protocols that had themselves been developed in response to a separate, unresolved case series in the 1970s. Myth versus reality. The narrative that Soviet authorities were uniquely incapable of identifying serial offenders is too simple. The failures in the Mikhasevich case were real and serious, but they were failures of structure, jurisdictional fragmentation, classified crime statistics, ideological resistance to acknowledging serial homicide, not failures of individual investigator competence. Ignatenko and his team, once they had the full picture in a single room, moved with considerable skill. The tragedy is how long it took to get the picture into that room. Chapter 7. Living in the Shadow of Fear. Vitebsk changed. Not dramatically. The city did not convulse or panic in the visible ways that Western news coverage would later associate with serial homicide cases. The Soviet model of public order, depended on managing information as carefully as managing facts, and open discussion of an unresolved killer operating for a decade would have constituted a political failure almost as serious as the crimes themselves. But the fear moved through the city the way cold moves through a building, finding every gap, settling into every quiet space. Factory managers received directives, phrased as recommendations, to add evening bus runs on routes where women workers traveled alone. Most complied. The buses were often half empty. Women had already stopped traveling alone. They moved in informal clusters, coordinating departure times across departments, waiting for one another in the heated foyers of factory buildings, until groups of 3 or 4 had assembled. Mothers kept track of their daughters' shifts with a precision that had nothing casual about it. Fathers waited at bus stops. Husbands drove routes they would not otherwise have bothered with, arriving at factory gates at shift change to collect wives who were entirely capable of traveling alone, but who no longer felt safe doing so, and who were, statistically, correct in that assessment. The rumors filled the space that official information refused to occupy. He was a militia officer. He was a military man stationed at the base outside the city. He was a truck driver who traveled the Polotsk-Vitebsk corridor. He was someone who had recently moved to the area. He was someone who had always been here. Each rumor was a rational attempt to explain the inexplicable by making it external, by locating the threat in a figure who could be identified as other, as not a neighbor, not a colleague, not the quiet man from 2 floors up. The quiet man from 2 floors up attended the community meetings where the rumors were discussed. He said nothing remarkable. He was, as always, Tichy. Teenagers who grew up in Vitebsk during the 1980s would later describe the period in interviews given to Russian journalists after Mikhasevich's trial. The specific way their parents spoke of the roads, the unspoken rule that certain routes were not taken after dark, the hypervigilance that had become so normalized it no longer felt like fear, but simply like the correct way to move through a city. One woman, who was 12 years old in 1983, described her mother sewing her school bag strap shorter so that it could be gripped more tightly. She didn't explain why, the woman said. I understood anyway. Fact. Soviet public health records from Vitebsk for the period 1981 to 1985 show a notable increase in documented cases of anxiety and insomnia among women aged 18 to 45. The records attribute the increase to workplace stress and housing pressures, the standard administrative language for phenomena the state preferred not to name directly. Myth versus reality. The assumption that Soviet citizens, conditioned to trust the state, would not have developed private fear responses to an unresolved threat misunderstands how people actually live inside authoritarian systems. The state controlled official information. It could not control what women said to each other in apartment stairwells. July 15, 1972. He did not look like what people imagined when they imagined this. That fact, by 1985, had become professionally embarrassing for the investigative framework that still organized violent crime around visible deviants, the drifter, the drinker, the man with a history of known offenses. Mikhasevich had no criminal record. He was evaluated twice during routine factory employment screenings in 1972 and again in 1979, and cleared both times. He had a functioning marriage. He participated in community activities. He was, in every external register, normal. Soviet criminologists working in the 1980s, cautiously, in a field that the state had historically treated with suspicion, viewing psychological explanations for crime as a capitalist indulgence, had begun to develop frameworks for what Russian literature called "seriene ubийство," serial killing, though the phrase itself carried ideological freight and was used sparingly in official documents. The profile that emerged from case analysis placed Mikhasevich firmly in what Western behavioral science categorized as the organized, non-social offender type: methodical, controlled, maintaining a functioning public identity, selecting victims according to criteria of vulnerability and access rather than personal connection. The primary drive was identified as control, not sexual gratification, though investigators explored this avenue thoroughly. Not financial gain. The consistent absence of robbery or sexual assault across all 14 cases pointed to a motivation that was, in its way, purer and therefore harder to explain: the act of domination itself, accomplished through strangulation, which requires sustained physical contact and the direct experience of another person's life ending under the perpetrator's hands. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, whose consultative work on serial cases in the Soviet and post-Soviet period made him the closest equivalent to a Western FBI profiler within Russian forensic psychiatry, described the psychological signature in terms that the Mikhasevich case exemplifies precisely. This offender does not experience what we would recognize as guilt because he does not experience the victim as a full person. She is a prop in a scenario he has been rehearsing for years. What he experiences after the act is not shame, it is completion, and completion, once experienced, requires repetition. Childhood rejection, military service, return to a small city with no adequate outlet for whatever was building inside him, and no institutional mechanism to detect it before it became lethal. These were the contributing factors. They were not. Criminologists were careful to emphasize explanations. They were preconditions. Millions of men experienced rejection, served in the military, and returned to small cities. The difference between Mikhasevich and those men was not any single biographical element. It was the specific combination and the absence of any point of intervention. The case entered Soviet and later Russian law enforcement training materials, not as an example of psychological abnormality, but as a demonstration of what criminologists called social camouflage, the way that stable employment, family life, and civic participation can function as a concealment mechanism for escalating violent fantasy. The lesson was structural. The monster does not announce himself. The system must learn to look without waiting for an announcement. In the fact, Mikhasevich scored within normal ranges on psychological evaluation instruments administered during both pre-trial assessment and post-conviction review. Forensic evaluators noted the characteristic flat affect, minimal emotional response to questioning about the victims, but found no markers of psychosis. He was, in the clinical determination, sane, fully aware of his actions, fully responsible for them. Myth versus reality. The popular conception of the serial offender as visibly strange, socially isolated, or behaviorally erratic is contradicted by the majority of documented cases. Research compiled by the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit across hundreds of case studies consistently finds that a significant proportion of serial offenders maintain stable relationships, steady employment, and unremarkable community profiles throughout their offense periods. Strangeness, in these cases, is retrospective. People remember it after they are told to look for it. Chapter 9. The Break in the Case. November 1985. The temperature had dropped below -10. A woman was walking home from the evening shift. She had noticed the vehicle before it slowed. A gas utility, the rear left tire worn unevenly. The passenger window manual cranked halfway down despite the cold. The driver had said something she couldn't fully hear. She had kept walking. He had driven a short distance, stopped, and she had turned and seen his face, clearly, for several seconds, in the light from his own headlamps, reflected off the snow, before the vehicle moved on. She noted the partial registration. She went home and wrote it down. Her name has not been made public in any source available for this account. In the trial record, she appears as Svidetil K, Witness K. She was, in the language of formal documentation, a survivor. In the language of what actually happened, she was the woman whose decision to look directly at the driver and then to write down what she saw ended the case. She gave her statement to the Vitebsk task force in November 1985. The partial registration, 3 characters from a 6-character plate, was not on its own enough, but it was a direction. Investigators cross-referenced the partial registration with vehicle records for the Vitebsk Industrial District, narrowing by vehicle type, model year, and registration area. The list ran to several dozen names. From those, they filtered against the tire wear specification recovered from evidence at 3 separate crime scenes, the irregular pattern on the rear left that the task force had been carrying in their files for 2 years. The list shortened to 4 vehicles. Of those 4, 1 belonged to an employee of a state enterprise on the eastern edge of the city, a driver and mechanic with 14 years of service, a quiet man with a clean record. Gennady Mikhasevich. Investigators did not move immediately. The discipline required to hold that information, to build the evidentiary frame before any approach, was considerable. One wrong step, a panicked flight, a destroyed vehicle, the disposal of physical evidence, could collapse the case before it reached a courtroom. The task force spent 72 hours constructing the approach. On the morning of the third day, Ignatenko's team attended Mikhasevich's workplace before his shift began. The vehicle was there. The rear left tire matched. Fibers recovered from the cab matched a sample retained from one of the 1982 crime scenes, a fragment of wool, dark blue, from a victim's coat. They had enough. The arrest was quiet, no resistance, no dramatic confrontation. Mikhasevich was taken to the regional prosecutor's office and placed in an interview room that smelled of floor polish and stale cigarettes, and Ignatenko sat across from him and laid the evidence on the table, piece by piece, without theater, and Mikhasevich watched it accumulate with the same flat, attentive expression that everyone who had ever known him described when they tried to explain what he was like. When Ignatenko finished, there was a silence. Then Mikhasevich began to talk. He talked for 3 days. The confession covered all 14 confirmed killings in detail that matched the physical evidence at every point. He provided locations, dates, victim descriptions, specific elements of each incident that had never been released publicly and that only the killer could have known. He described the first killing, Anna Fedorova, December 1971, the road to Polotsk, with the same precision he applied to the most recent. He expressed no distress in the telling. He described logistics. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Yevgeny Tselms, reviewing the confession transcripts for the Ministry of Internal Affairs assessment, noted, "He speaks of these events the way a competent professional discusses completed assignments. The flatness is not performance, it is not shock, it is the absence of the internal structure that would make distress possible. He has no architecture for guilt. He never developed one." The task force had expected the confession to feel like resolution. It did not feel like resolution. It felt like the cold in the interview room becoming clearer, as if what had been ambient and tolerable was suddenly, precisely, identifiable. 14 cases, 11 years, one man who drove home after every one of them and ate dinner and went to sleep. The break in the case had come from a woman who looked directly at the driver and wrote down what she saw. She is the reason the trial happened. She is not in the public record by name. Fact. The fiber evidence that contributed to the physical case against Mikhasevich had been retained in Vitebsk's Medical Legal Bureau since 1982, 3 years before the arrest. The sample's significance was only recognized when investigators had a specific vehicle to match it against. This is a documented pattern in forensic casework. Physical evidence collected correctly and stored appropriately is not lost. It waits for the question that makes it relevant. Myth versus reality. Post-arrest accounts in Soviet media attributed the casebreak primarily to the tireless work of Vitebsk militia investigators. This framing, while not false, obscured the critical role of the surviving witness. The witness, a private citizen, a woman walking home from a shift, who made a clear-headed decision under fear, was the operational turning point. Institutional credit and individual courage are not the same thing. Number 10. Capture, Trial, and Fate. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, the news had moved through Vitebsk in the way that only genuinely consequential news moves in a small industrial city, without an official announcement, person to person, through factory floors and apartment block stairwells, arriving in each household with the same uncertain mixture of relief and residual dread. Was it really over? Mikhasevich was held at the Vitebsk pretrial detention facility through the winter of 1985-1986, while the prosecutor's office assembled the formal case. The preparation was meticulous. The confession, though comprehensive, was tested against every available piece of physical and witness evidence. The defense, state-appointed, as required, challenged procedural elements but found nothing that materially altered the evidentiary picture. The trial opened in Vitebsk in the spring of 1987. It was closed to the public. Victims' families were admitted as an exception. They sat together in the gallery, parents, siblings, husbands, the fiancé who still carried Maria Koroleva's photograph, and they watched Gennady Mikhasevich sit at the defendant's table in a gray institutional suit and answer questions in the same quiet, precise manner that everyone who had known him described, and had always described, and would describe again to every journalist who would later ask. The verdict was delivered after 8 days of proceedings, 14 counts of murder. Guilty on all 14. The presiding judge sentenced him to death, the standard disposition under Soviet criminal law for aggravated homicide at this scale. The sentence was not subject to appeal in any form that would have meaningfully altered the outcome. Gennady Mikhasevich was executed in 1988. The method, under Soviet practice, was a single shot to the back of the head, administered without prior notice to the condemned. For the families in the gallery, the verdict was not an end. It was a specific kind of punctuation, a full stop placed at the conclusion of a sentence that had been running unfinished for years. The grief did not end in that courtroom. The waiting did. Fact: under Soviet legal procedure, the families of victims in capital cases were not informed of the execution date in advance. Many learned of Mikhasevich's death through informal channels weeks after the fact. This practice, designed to prevent organized protest or public disruption, meant that even the final institutional acknowledgement of the case was withheld from the people it most directly concerned. Chapter 11. Inside the Mind. He was cooperative in custody. That fact requires a moment, because cooperation implies investment in the process, a desire to be understood or to be seen, or to construct a version of events that reflects favorably on the subject. None of those things appear to be what motivated Mikhasevich's 3 days of detailed, uninterrupted confession. He talked, forensic reviewers concluded, because the talking itself was a continuation of the same impulse that had driven the crimes, the direct, controlled communication of his experience of events to an audience that had no choice but to listen. He spoke of the first impulse, the adolescent rejection, the years of accumulation, with the retrospective clarity of a man who had organized the material many times in his own mind before being asked about it. He described the wire beneath the driver's seat with the same precision he applied to every other operational detail. He spoke of the relief that followed each killing, the temporary cessation of whatever pressure had been building, and the inexorable return of that pressure over the weeks and months that followed. He never used the word compulsion in any of his recorded statements, but the structure of what he described was clinical compulsion with perfect self-awareness, a man who understood exactly what he was doing and could not, or would not, stop. Forensic psychiatrists noted the flat affect throughout, the consistent absence of distress, remorse, or emotional engagement when discussing the victims, not hostility, not defensiveness, simply the absence of the internal register that would make those responses possible. He does not experience the victims as having ongoing significance, Dr. Teams wrote in her assessment. They are historical facts, events that occurred. He speaks of them with the same emotional texture as he speaks of weather or road conditions. This is not concealment. This is the actual landscape of his interior life. He was, by every diagnostic standard applied to him, legally sane. The determination was uncomfortable for several people involved in the process. It should be. Sanity, in this context, means that everything he did, he chose. Fact: post-conviction psychiatric assessments of Mikhasevich were classified within the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs system and have only been partially referenced in subsequent academic literature. Full records, if they survive, remain within successor state archives. Myth versus reality. The common assumption that a person who commits this scale of violence must be, by definition, mentally ill is not supported by the forensic record in the majority of documented serial homicide cases. Mental illness and moral responsibility are distinct categories. The conflation of the two is understandable as a psychological defense mechanism. It makes the crimes feel like an aberration of pathology rather than an aberration of will. The forensic record does not always cooperate with that comfort. Chapter 12. The Legacy of the Case. The Mikhasevich case changed things. Not immediately, not dramatically. The Soviet system was not structured for the kind of public institutional reckoning that the case warranted and that Western criminological literature would eventually demand of it. But within the internal workings of the Byelorussian militia and the broader Soviet law enforcement apparatus, the case generated structural consequences that outlasted the state in which they originated. Interdistrict case coordination protocols were revised in the Byelorussian SSR following the investigation's conclusion. The fragmentation that had allowed 14 cases to sit in separate filing systems for 11 years was formally acknowledged in internal Ministry of Internal Affairs reviews, not publicly, not with attribution of blame, but in the language of procedural reform that Soviet bureaucracy used when it recognized a systemic failure without wishing to name it as such. Centralized criminal record systems were expanded. Cross-district communication requirements for homicide cases involving similar circumstances were tightened. The reforms were modest by the standards of what was needed, but they were real. The case also contributed to a slow, cautious shift in Soviet and post-Soviet criminology toward taking serial homicide seriously as a distinct investigative category requiring specialized analytical methods. Viktor Luniev's foundational work on Soviet crime, published in the post-Soviet period, cites the Mikhasevich investigation as a demonstration that the standard district-level investigative model was structurally incapable of detecting and responding to trans-jurisdictional serial offending. That observation arrived late, but it arrived. In Belarus, the independent successor state to the Byelorussian SSR, the case is remembered not as a triumph of Soviet justice, but as a documentation of its failures and its limits. 14 women died across a span that, with earlier coordination, better information sharing, and a willingness to name what was happening, should have been significantly shorter. The lesson has been absorbed, imperfectly, into modern investigative practice. It was purchased at a price that should never be forgotten. Fact: at least one case of wrongful conviction occurred in the Vitebsk area during the Mikhasevich investigation period. An individual prosecuted for a killing that the full trial record later established was committed by Mikhasevich. The wrongful conviction was acknowledged and formally overturned following Mikhasevich's confession, but the individual concerned had already served a significant prison term. Myth versus reality. The narrative of Soviet justice as uniformly effective within its own terms is challenged by the wrongful conviction associated with this case. When crime statistics are classified and interjurisdictional coordination is poor, the pressure to close cases can produce convictions that are administratively satisfying but factually wrong. Justice that takes the wrong person does not reduce the harm, it compounds it. Number sign Chapter 13. Could it happen again? The question is not comfortable. The honest answer is, partially. In the specific form the Vitebsk case took, 11 years, 14 victims, a killer operating undetected across district lines in an information vacuum. No, not in a modern developed state context. The infrastructure that made that duration possible has been replaced, but the conditions that produced the offender have not. Modern traffic cameras, mobile phone triangulation, automated license plate recognition, and rapid DNA analysis would compress the investigative window from years to months. The surviving witness who provided the partial registration in 1985 would today have produced a full plate number with timestamp from 3 cameras before she reached her front door. Centralized criminal databases in most developed states now flag geographic and methodological clusters in homicide cases within weeks rather than years. The jurisdictional fragmentation that allowed the Vitebsk cases to sit in separate filing systems is, in most Western and modernizing post-Soviet systems, an acknowledged and addressed structural vulnerability. The tools are better, but the warning signs remain identical. Clusters of similar method killings in peri-urban or rural corridors, victims drawn from the same demographic and geographic pattern, a suspect who uses a vehicle professionally and has established reason to travel the affected routes, a man whose social profile is unremarkable in precisely the ways that tend to reassure investigators. The behavioral markers that forensic profilers look for in this type of offender have not changed because human psychology has not changed. The compulsion toward control. The methodical escalation. The post-offense return to normality that is not a performance but a genuine psychological state. The monitoring of the investigation as it develops. What has changed is the quality of attention available. Modern behavioral analysis units in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, and increasingly across the former Soviet space maintain databases of unsolved homicides with enough analytical infrastructure to surface patterns that would have taken the Vitebsk task force 3 years to identify manually. Interpol frameworks allow cross-border pattern recognition. Forensic genetic genealogy has reopened cases that appeared permanently cold. The gap between the offender and the investigation is shorter now. It is not closed. What cannot be technologically solved is the human predisposition to assume that the threat comes from outside, from the stranger, the transient, the visibly disturbed. Mikhasevich was not outside. He was inside. He was quiet. He was reliable. The women of Vitebsk knew, by the early 1980s, that danger lived somewhere in their city. They had made accommodations for it, walking in groups, shortening their routes, keeping their daughters inside. They had correctly assessed the environment. They had not been able to identify the face. When the face was finally identified, it was familiar. That is the part that does not change. As of the most recent public reporting, the Belarusian Ministry of Internal Affairs has not released the complete Mikhasevich case file for independent academic review. Researchers working in this area continue to rely on partial trial excerpts, published journalist accounts from the Soviet period, and criminological literature that references the case from internal sources. Myth versus reality. The belief that modern surveillance infrastructure has eliminated the possibility of a prolonged, undetected serial offense series is contradicted by documented cases in the 21st century across multiple developed states. Technology narrows the window. Institutional coordination, consistent attention to victim-centered reporting, and willingness to classify connected cases as connected remain human decisions. Technology does not make those decisions. People do. There is a municipal cemetery on the eastern edge of Vitebsk. Anna Federova is buried there. So are others from the trial record. The graves are maintained by the families who are still living and by the families of families, the second generation who know the story only through the telling of it, through the specific language parents and grandparents use when they explain why a particular road has a particular weight to it, why the mention of a certain year produces a particular silence at the table. Justice arrived. It arrived 11 years late. It arrived through the courage of a woman who looked directly at a driver and wrote down what she saw. It arrived through the methodical work of investigators who, once they finally had all the pieces in a single room, put them together correctly and quickly. It arrived in a courtroom in 1987 before the families of the 14 in the form of a verdict that cannot be appealed and cannot be revised. It was justice. It was not enough. The 14 women who appear in the Vitebsk trial record were not symbols or statistics or lessons in investigative failure. They were specific people with specific lives, a coat being saved for, a research program, a son watching from a window, a letter unsent on a desk. Every one of them had a morning after the morning they died that they did not get to have. The system that allowed the case to run for 11 years has been modified. The grief that populated a gallery in a Vitebsk courtroom in 1987 does not modify. It persists in the particular private way that grief persists when it has been waiting too long for the institutional acknowledgement that should have come years earlier. The case is closed. The record is permanent. Number 692100 2932 1 Mikhasevich Trial Transcript 1987 Vitebsk Regional Court. Excerpts published in Izvestia, 1987. Additional excerpts cited in post-Soviet academic criminological reviews. 2. Byelorussian SSR Ministry of Internal Affairs, 1986. Internal Case Summary, Regional Homicide Series Investigation, Vitebsk Oblast, 1971 to 1985. Internal document, referenced in Lunev, 2005, and subsequent academic literature. 3. Lunev, V.V., 2005, Prestupnost XXV Mirovi, Regionalye i Rossiyskiye Tendency, Crime of the 20th Century, World, Regional, and Russian Trends, Moscow, Norma Publishing. Chapter 14 addresses Soviet-era serial homicide case data. 4. Gurov, A.I. 1990, Professional Naya Prestupnost v Rossi, Professional Crime in Russia, Moscow, Legal Literature. Contains early post-Soviet analysis of organized and repeat violent offending. 5. Kuznetsova, N.F. 2001, Criminologia, Criminology, Moscow State University Press. Chapter on Violent Offender Profiling Methodology includes discussion of Soviet case precedents. 6. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, 1995, Training Reference Materials, International Serial Homicide Case Studies, Quantico, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Soviet-era cases referenced in the Comparative Methodology section. 7. Bukhanovsk, A.O., 1999. Seryny Ubitsa, Kto on? The Serial Killer, Who Is He? Rostov-on-Don, LRNTC Press. Foundational Russian-language profiling text. Bukhanovsky's consultative work on Soviet-era cases is extensively documented. 8. Interview with lead investigator, Nikolai Ignatenko, Sovetskaya Belorussia, published 1988, reprinted in part in Russian-language criminological review materials. 9. Vitebsk Medico-Legal Bureau, 1985. Forensic Report on Ligature Marks, Comparative Analysis, Multi-Site Homicide Series. Case reference documents retained in Vitebsk Regional Prosecutor Archive. 10. Court Verdict, Published Excerpts, Izvestia, 1987, reported the conviction on 14 counts and sentence of execution. 11. Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, 2002, Исторический обзор, Серийные преступления в поздний советский period, Historical Review, Serial Crimes in the Late Soviet Period, Internal Review Document, cited in subsequent criminological literature. 12. Criminolog, A.V., 1999, Серийное убийство в поздний советский period, Serial Murder in the Late Soviet Period, Государство и право, State and Law Journal, Volume 14, Number 3, pp. 88-202. 13. Survivor Witness Statement, November 1985. Filed with Vitebsk Regional Prosecutor's Office. Referenced in trial transcript and task force review documents. 14. Pristavkin, A.D. 1984. Consultative Memorandum to Vitebsk Regional Task Force. Referenced in post-trial Ministry of Internal Affairs case review documentation. 15. Talms, Ye N. 1987. Forensic Psychiatric Assessment, Mikhasevich, G.M., submitted to Vitebsk Regional Court, referenced in Ministry of Internal Affairs Internal Post-Trial Review. Case File, The Vitebsk Strangler, Status, Closed, 1988. Record, Permanent.